Mayra, did you do this? Did you kill your friend?
No answers, just tears as she walked out of jail. This is a woman who police say committed a heinous murder, allegedly stabbing a victim more than 100 times. Mayra Velasquez had seemingly been living a life of luxury up until her arrest this month. She's now charged with capital murder in this case that dates back more than a decade to 2012. Police say they have DNA that proves she's the killer, but her defense attorney is making some interesting arguments as she is now free on what appears to be a shockingly low bond. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. You might remember when police announced that they believe they found the person who fatally stabbed a woman more than 100 times in a cold case that goes back to 2012, there was a detective who was overcome with emotion, in tears, when she was asked what it meant to bring closure to the victim's family, people who had been waiting 14 years for justice. But that is, frankly, just one side of the story. What's the other side? What's the side from the defendant? Well, now we're starting to hear from Mayra Velasquez's defense and what her perspective on this may be. Here is video of Mayra Velasquez, charged with capital murder, walking out of the Tarrant County Jail in Texas this week. Her attorney says she is not guilty. Her bond was set at $450,000, which, let's face it, we're talking about capital murder here. That does feel shockingly low considering the charge that she's facing. And you have to wonder, what does that mean for how strong the case may actually be against this real estate agent, mom, and wife? Now, Velasquez's defense attorney is going public, and he says his client's innocent. That may not come as a surprise. It is often what people hired to defend those accused of crime say. But it's how her defense attorney is reportedly pushing back on the notion that this case against his client was airtight that we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. And you do have to wonder, where does Velasquez go from here? How can authorities make sure she doesn't flee, considering the chance that she could potentially be sentenced to death in this case? Now, it certainly doesn't appear that Mayra Velasquez spent the last 14 years burdened by the guilt of taking a life. Now, obviously, social media only shows us just a glimpse into what someone's been up to, but when you look at her social media, she worked as what appeared to be a successful real estate agent in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and she seems to have been married. She's the mother to a son who was born the year after police say she allegedly killed her friend. And boy, did she travel. Paris, Jamaica, other parts of Europe, South America. I mean, she appears to truly have been living a dream with her family by her side. Now, before I get to what her defense may look like, why her defense attorney says that she is innocent, I want to give you a quick run through of how police say they connected the dots and arrived on Mayra Velasquez as an alleged killer in this case. So let's start with the victim, Iracema Chavez. She was 33 years old when she was found dead in her apartment, stabbed to death inside her unit in January of 2012 in Arlington, Texas, which is near Dallas. Again, she was allegedly stabbed more than 100 times. Think of just how long, and not to be morbid, but how long it would take to actually do that. It's horrific. One of the major pieces of evidence that police put out to the public as they search for the killer is this video they say is from the night of Chavez's murder. It's surveillance video outside her apartment showing this shadowy figure in sweats going up the stairs, going to the door of her apartment. Their head is down. It appears they try to open the door, but then they just wait. And after about a minute or so, they go inside. Family members, then the next day, they went to check on Chavez, and that's when they found her dead.
The Tarrant County medical examiners later determined that she was stabbed more than 100 times. A TV was reported missing from the apartment. We believe that the killer took the TV. Detectives at the time conducted a very thorough investigation, pursued several leads, but they could not fully identify the suspect.
Here's what we know about the crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry, and you just saw that video there. Does that mean that Chavez knew her killer? someone that she would just let into their apartment, maybe because they had been there before.
The strong lead that we had was a droplet of fresh blood that was recovered from a bedroom TV stand inside the apartment. The crime lab determined that the blood sample did not come from the victim and it belonged to an unidentified Hispanic female. Detectives uploaded the DNA profile into CODIS, which is a national database used to compare DNA profiles in criminal investigations. But we never got a match.
So this case in 2012, 2013, 2014, and so on, it went cold. There were no arrests. In 2016, 4 years after the murder, there was a blood sample provided to a DNA testing company called Parabon Nanolabs. Again, this was the blood sample. It was found in the apartment on a TV stand, and law enforcement allege that it was fresh, that it would have come from someone within the timeline of when they say that Chavez was murdered. Now, Parabon Nanolabs then put together a profile of what the owner of that blood may look like, the potential killer. And this is what they came up with. It's a woman believed to be in her 20s. And when you look at this, you have to admit that there is a very strong resemblance to Mayra Velasquez. But in 2016, this goes out, no arrest, and the case continues to be cold. We get to 2024, and that's when the FBI gets involved, and they take the DNA sample and they analyze it with genetic genealogy. And we've seen this crack cold cases before. It's when you take a DNA sample, in this case, the blood, and then you run it through publicly available databases. You think of like ancestry sites and see if there's any matches to someone who could be related to the owner of that sample. And earlier this year, the FBI says they were able to connect that sample to Mayra Velasquez. Law enforcement have not said more about specifically what the break was in that DNA to be able to say that she's the one who matches the blood. Arlington, Texas police then followed Mayra Velasquez. They put surveillance on her and they waited for her to discard trash. And reportedly, she had lunch with some friends at a restaurant. And that is when law enforcement swoops in after Mayra leaves. They take some of the items, including a fork, and the fork reportedly tested positive to that DNA sample found in Chavez's home in 2012. That was according to WFAA television.
She was a close friend of the victim who lived just a few miles away from the crime scene. With this new information in hand, our homicide unit began conducting follow-up investigation into Ms. Velasquez. In May, they were able to obtain a sample of DNA from a discarded trash, and we sent it to our crime lab for further analysis. The lab determined that the DNA was a match to the droplet of blood recovered from the crime scene.
Police arrested Mayra Velasquez. They did it at a traffic stop, and they charged her with capital murder. Now, on top of the DNA connection, they say that the victim's cell phone gave insight on the relationship the two of them had. They won't say any more, though, about what the relationship was like other than them being close friends. They also say that Velasquez had been in Chavez's apartment before. Police, though, they don't have a murder weapon, and we don't know what the potential motive would be for a murder, especially one as horrific as this. Police say that Mayra did give an interview to police, but they won't say what she said other than it would be helpful to their prosecution. When authorities announced that Mayra Velasquez was the person who allegedly killed Chavez, and you watched this news conference, you did feel that law enforcement felt a sense of closure. She's innocent until proven guilty, but this arrest in this case was a major moment. They flat out said they don't believe that anybody else was involved in the murder of Iracema Chavez. And then you have this moment where a member of law enforcement is asked just what it means to them to bring closure to the family of Chavez.
Miss Velasquez, I'm sorry. Miss Velasquez was interviewed, and in that interview, we learned information that will be helpful in that process. I'm not going to disclose that right now. They were friends, and Miss Velasquez had been in the apartment before. But we were able to obtain some information from her in the interview which will help in her prosecution.
And you see the emotion there from that detective. But that is, as we look at, as in all cases, that's just one side of the story. What does the defense have to say? Was this real estate agent really someone for years building up a life, trying to leave behind a horrific memory of a terrible, terrible crime? Now, I will say, to be frank, we've left multiple messages for Velasquez's legal team to come on this show to help us understand what happened from her perspective, but we haven't heard back. The invitation, though, absolutely still stands for them to come on. Her attorney, Frank Sellers, gave an interview to the CBS TV station in Dallas, and he says that Mayra Velasquez, his client, is confused as to why she's being charged with murder. Quote, "I think she's completely paralyzed right now. I went to visit with her this morning, and she asked why this was capital murder. It was a shock to her when she was told that it was because a TV was stolen. I think her words were, 'What would I want a television for?' End quote." Now, remember, the TV was something that was missing from Chavez's apartment in 2012. And Sellers also seems to be taking aim at this video, that video of the person going into Chavez's apartment on the night that she was murdered, up the stairs and into the apartment unit. He said, quote, "10 minutes after the person we see in the video enters that apartment, the surveillance is cut. So I think the most likely conclusion to be drawn is that the person who cut the surveillance, more likely than not, did the killing." He also said that when he looks at the video, he feels like the person you're seeing going up those stairs is a man, not a woman. Now, prosecutors haven't commented on those statements that Sellers made, but Sellers also did make a very interesting comment about genetic genealogy and these cold cases that we have seen get cracked because of DNA testing. Now, this case apparently is one of several cold cases, according to CBS, that have been cracked just this month in the DFW area. And CBS does write in their story, quote, "The attorney for Velasquez claims without evidence that he doesn't believe local authorities cracking so many cold cases is a coincidence." They say that this is what Frank Sellers told them, and this is interesting, and I think it's important to talk about. He said, quote, "It sure does seem like there was a coordinated effort over the last 3 or 4 weeks to put out a lot of news cases about cold cases being solved, and this is one of those caught up in that dragnet. I think there must have been a government grant of some sort that went to put these cases together and try to solve these cold cases." Now, Sellers also said that he requested bond be set at $450,000. And he says that the prosecution didn't oppose that, and that is the bond that the judge set, which is an amount that Velasquez was able to make, and now she is out of jail, even though she is charged with capital murder. Reportedly, the conditions of her bond, she has to wear a GPS monitor, and she is not allowed to leave Tarrant or Dallas counties. Joining us now to talk more about this is criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. When I heard $450,000 for a capital murder suspect and you see her walking out of jail, what does that tell you about this case, that she was able to make bond and bond was set at less than $500,000 based on this charge?
It's definitely interesting that her bond was set significantly low in comparison to a lot of other capital murder cases. Oftentimes, with those cases, you'll see a defendant being held no bail, no release because of the allegations and the risk of threat to the community, and also because of the risk of flight that they could pose if ultimately convicted. And so we don't essentially, or the court essentially does not want a potential convicted murderer fleeing the country or possibly endangering anybody else. But the $450,000 bond seems to be sort of, along with the GPS monitor, seems to be sort of a trade-off. The allegations in this case are approximately 14 years old. So between that time frame, the defendant in this case seems to have gone on to lead a productive life. She's traveled, she's obtained her real estate license and gone on to live what seems to be a healthy and productive life. We also know that she doesn't have a criminal history. And so the court's going to weigh a bunch of factors, including a risk of flight, threat to the community, whether or not she has a criminal history, which we don't believe that she has. And also they can take a look at the strength of the government's case. And I don't know that in this particular case, that's 14 years old, if their case is as strong as it could be, as opposed to someone who maybe is alleged to have murdered somebody maybe a year ago and they have fresh, new quickly generated evidence in the case. And so I think what the judge here was essentially split the baby in allowing her to remain out on bail with electronic monitoring.
Because, there was this news conference when they announced her arrest, and the FBI's there and local authorities. And it's like you have this detective who is getting emotional, like talking about the moment that they told the family of Iracema Chavez that they had made this arrest. And it's like, you hear that. And I know that that's just one side of the story. Like, there was this, like, almost, I know there are allegations, but like this sense of closure, like that we did it. And I would not have suspected a week later that we would see her walking out of jail. When it comes to cold cases, and we've seen a lot of cold cases solved, this genetic genealogy it has been, very successful in helping crack cases that seemed unsolvable at a period of time. But how does that impact a case, knowing that what we're talking about, the evidence that was collected, the interviews that were done back then, we're talking about something from 14 years ago?
It can definitely impact a case, and more so positively. I think a part of the reason why there was never anyone that was ultimately arrested until more recently is because of the lack of DNA evidence, or at least the capability of testing this genetic DNA evidence that ultimately showed that she was the alleged suspect in the case. And so what I think a lot of times happens is, as science evolves and as the legal system evolves, there are more mechanisms that are put into place to ensure that, DNA testing and other science-based evidence are being put forth and processed appropriately and correctly. And as the world, changes with AI and all other capabilities, there is more of a push to be able to solve these sorts of crimes.
Because I also think, though, like if you're her defense attorney, this evidence was collected back in 2012, and like things have changed since then. I'm sure in the way that police departments gather evidence at a crime scene. Like, as to have you put on the hat of the defense attorney that you are. I mean, how can you attack like the time frame and police seem pretty confident with like the way that the evidence was collected, but how does that work for the defense to be able to say, I mean, this was so long ago when all of this happened?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that the defense attorney is really going to hone in on here is the chain of custody, and also the lack of the ability to preserve this DNA evidence. So, we have to know who collected this DNA sample, when was it collected, how many hands did it pass through prior to being stored, prior to being tested, and was there any disruption in the integrity of that DNA evidence? So, again, who had access to it? How was it stored? Was it in a safe and appropriate condition? If it's in a cooler, was the temperature appropriate, and all of those certain things that ultimately could factor into whether or not the DNA evidence could be altered in any sort of way. And the defense attorney is going to say, hey, listen, this case is 14 years old. The likelihood is you didn't properly obtain this evidence. You've had it for this long. Was it stored appropriately and properly to ensure the integrity of that DNA evidence? And what also people don't realize is that 14 years is a long time. So the individuals that were responsible for obtaining that evidence, they need to be called as witnesses to testify at a trial. So unfortunately, sometimes people pass away. That is going to, if that is the case with anybody who may have been in the chain of custody and obtaining this DNA evidence, that's certainly going to factor into the strength of the government's case and how much they can prove. Because if we have witnesses that are unable to testify or absent, or there weren't things that were memorialized by those witnesses at that time, and they're no longer here to testify before us today, that's certainly going to be a hindrance for the prosecution.
I'm on the outside, obviously, of this investigation, we all are in watching this. And it's like, in a lot of these cases, it's like you have the DNA that is this moment and you're like, they got him, right? Like, that's it. Like, we've seen, other cold cases being cracked where maybe the DNA is on. I remember in one, it was DNA under the fingerprints of a victim, and it showed that she was in a struggle. In another case, the DNA may be on like a murder weapon. In this case, the DNA link proves that, this drop of blood potentially belongs to Mayra Velasquez, and police are saying that and I'm sure this will be argued, that like the drop of blood, it was still fresh enough to put within the timeline of when this mysterious figure enters her apartment on the night she was murdered. But it's like, what stands out to you with, like, it's a drop of blood on a TV stand. It's not like a drop of blood that would be on a murder weapon or something like that. It seems like that's an opening for the defense here, just based on what we know. And I'm sure there's a lot of other evidence that we don't.
If these women were friends the way that it's been portrayed, there's a high likelihood that the defendant's DNA would have been in her apartment anyways. If she's ever visited with her, if she's ever spent time with her at her home, then there's a strong likelihood that the defendant's DNA would have been there altogether. Now, the fact that, or what we believe is going to be a fact, that the DNA evidence belongs to the defendant and it was on the TV stand, it certainly creates the idea, or circumstantially creates the idea, that she could have perpetuated this crime. Is it still a slam dunk? No, we still don't have a murder weapon. We don't know what, if any, reason could have been the motive. Not that the prosecution has to prove motive, but what it has to make sense. You know, the allegation here is that there is a murder. I think there was some TV involved in the stealing of a TV, things like that. And to be stabbed 100 times is certainly a crime of passion. So what occurred prior to this incident that would have shown that the defendant actually had a reason or a motive to commit this crime? What also stands out to me is there seems to be some evidence of a surveillance system on the victim's home that shows a figure going in approximately 10 minutes before the surveillance is cut. The defense attorney in this case is indicating that it appears to be a male. So is there anybody else that could have been a suspect? We know that the prosecution in this case is saying, no, there's not. But that is still something that needs to be explored to an extent, because when you see cases where there's a stabbing of 100 times, that is certainly a crime of passion. We know that domestic violence cases, if this is a male or could have been a male, certainly with domestic violence cases, there are scenarios where if this is a male and maybe he's an ex-partner, or there was some domestic violence going on between the two of them, if there was in fact a male, and we still don't know, that's to be disputed, the likelihood of this being a domestic violence incident as opposed to a murder at the hands of a friend.
How might you prove, because we have this video of Mayra Velasquez just walking, it's the first time we've like seen her in person, as opposed to like social media pictures. Like, you see her and the local news was there as she bonds out of jail. The framing of it though was different than like this person who police believe is her in 2012 going up the steps of this apartment complex. Like, how might you, if you're the prosecution, prove, and I guess this goes both ways because it'd be the defense too, like, do you have her, I guess if you're a defense attorney, this goes to trial, like, do you have her walk around the courtroom? I mean, people can obviously see her because you do look at it and it's someone in, sweats, they're looking down. It's hard to tell who it is at that
Right.
point. Like, how might you prove that it is or isn't Mayra Velasquez?
And you're asking the right question, because with this case is going to hinge on identity. We already know it's undisputed that this woman was murdered. It's undisputed in the manner in which she was murdered, but it's the identity of the individual who committed the act. So in order to prove or disprove that it was the defendant in this case, if I, as the defense attorney, believe that it was a male, as her defense attorney is asserting, you're absolutely right. I'm going to have her get up. I'm going to have her walk around. It's called demonstrative evidence. Walk around that courtroom so that the jury can physically see what she looks like, or also obtain photos of what she may have looked like at the time. Was her height consistent with that person who was picked up on the surveillance? Was her weight consistent with that back on that date and at that time? Or was it consistent with more of what the defense is going to say, a male? And so if it's from the defense aspect, you're going to want to put her up there, have her walk around in front of the jury to say this isn't consistent with the identity of the individual in the surveillance camera. If I'm the prosecutor and I'm like, oh no, this is the woman, this is the person, and it's not a male, then I'm going to point out, you can't have a defendant, you can't force a defendant to testify, but I'm going to try my best to point out at the defense table, the defendant here, when we're talking about the identity of the person in this video, the defendant's frame at the time, or physical frame at the time, is consistent with who was in that video. Yes, she may have had a hoodie on at this point. Yes, she may have had additional clothing, but her frame is consistent with the person that is in this video surveillance. And also, who would have known, who would have visited that apartment, and who would have had reason to know that there was a surveillance camera and to cut it, and how to do that.
That's also a really good point. Yeah, because I wouldn't even know like how to do that myself. And who knows, back in 2012, like, access to those type of things, it's also unclear. I mean, it does go back to 2012 though, and you feel like video might have been put out there with this case going cold for so long. Interesting statement from Mayra Velasquez's attorney, and Frank Sellers, and CBS says he says something along the lines of, or his quote is, "It sure does seem like there was a coordinated effort over the last 3 or 4 weeks to put out a lot of news cases about cold cases being solved. And this is one of those that was caught up in the dragnet. I think there must have been a government grant of some sort that went to put these cases together and try to solve these cold cases," which, they had been, and you can find news stories that go back to 2012, 2016, 2020, 2024. Like they had been working to solve this for a long time. So maybe it's a coincidence that a lot of these cold cases are being solved around the same time. I think what he's probably trying to do is just challenge what has been, kind of becoming the norm, that these cold cases end up being cracked. And there's something that, police departments like to be able to do when it comes to DNA, like all of that leading to the question of like, it comes to DNA. I mean, how hard is it as a defense attorney to challenge the findings, whether it be genetic genealogy or whatever DNA link it may be?
It can be very difficult to challenge the findings. And so, what ultimately a defense attorney would try to do is challenge the way that the DNA evidence was preserved, also challenge the manner in which the testing was conducted, to argue it lacks reliability. So, assuming that this case goes to trial, I do expect that her defense attorney at some point is going to say the testing lacks reliability. The integrity of the DNA sample has been tampered with and it hasn't been preserved in the appropriate manner, challenging the individuals who are conducting the testing. Are they in fact qualified to conduct that type of testing? Do they have any other cases where they maybe had misidentified DNA or had any errors with the DNA samples that they had previously? All of those things are going to come into play, and all of those things are what a defense attorney is going to want to challenge, on top of, in this particular case, the surveillance video. I expect that the defense attorney here is going to also argue there was no motive for the defendant to commit this act. Why would she want to steal a TV? At the time she may have, had a TV of her own, or whatever the argument is going to be. And the point is that at the end of the day, when the government comes with these cases, they have to prove each and every element of each and every offense beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, we know it's a capital murder case. Not only that, but they're also going to have to prove the identity of the individual that committed this act. And the defense is going to attack that the DNA is not enough, that they were friends, that she had been there previously, that her DNA was already there because they've spent time there together, and that this blood stain is not enough to convict the defendant of murder.
And we'll see what happens, because there is still a lot, it seems like law enforcement is keeping close to the vest. We know about the blood. We know that there's some cell phone, stuff for background. But yeah, you would have to think, that there is something that they haven't released as of yet. We'll see what happens. But very interesting case, and one that you have this family waiting 14 years for answers. And we'll see if this is the answer to who took their loved one. Safa Robinson-Ferrer, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we are also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.